Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Megan Meadows, and I serve as the Director of the Division of Energy Assistance with the Office of Community Services and the Administration for Children and Families. On behalf of this division, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on completing the Federal Fiscal Year 2023 Performance Data Form. Today's discussion will focus on Module 1, the Grantee Survey. Today's webinar has two presenters experienced in providing LIHEAP technical assistance to state coordinators and program staff. Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates is a former LIHEAP director and works regularly to assist states with in-depth technical assistance. And Dan Bouch of Apprise has more than 10 years of experience conducting LIHEAP report training and review. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will focus on key items needed to complete Module 1 of the Performance Data Form. This form is due in OLDC on January 31st, 2024. Hard to believe we're almost to 2024. And the purpose of today's webinar is to review key requirements for completing the form, explain minor updates made to the report for fiscal year 2023, to review the data you need to prepare the report, to review the process for submitting and updating the report. The audience for today's webinar is state LIHEAP coordinators and fiscal program staff that assist with completing the performance data form. If you have staff unable to attend or you want to hear the training again, today's webinar will be repeated on January 9th, 2024, and it will be the same webinar with the same content. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us today, and we hope today's training is valuable. With that, Melissa, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Megan. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes long, and what you'll notice is in the sidebar of the GoToWebinar, there is a handout section, and there are about 5 handouts there, and that includes these slides as well as templates and other resources that could help you with this report. This webinar is also being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. Next slide. So we're going to take questions as we go via the question box in the GoToWebinar sidebar. So there is a questions box, and you'll see this little diagram here to show you how to get to it. At the end of the webinar, we'll take those questions and answer them, and anything that we don't get to, we'll follow up via a broadcast email or an individual email to the person who asked the question. Next slide. So you're going to notice that the content on these slides is pretty dense, and that's because reports are technical, and we want to give you a lot of assistance as you walk through and complete this. And we know that many of you will come back to the slide deck for guidance or pass the slide deck on to someone who's helping you with the report for guidance. And so this is a little bit of an outline, and we've said before, this is kind of like an index or a table of contents, so that if you need to get to a particular section or look at particular information, this will help guide the way. Next slide, please. We'd like to start with a poll, as we normally do, and what we'd like to learn, just so that we can set the tone for this webinar, is how prepared do you think your team is for completing the FY 2023 Grantee Survey? This is Module 1 of the Performance Data Form. Are you not at all prepared, so you haven't turned your attention to this? Are you a little prepared? You're aware that it's out there, but you really haven't planned or gotten started on it yet. Are you mostly prepared, or are you very prepared? And we'll let Joseph cancel this, or switch it over when he sees most people have responded.
I would give a few more seconds here.
Okay, so this shows that most of you are at least a little prepared. You know this is coming, and a big chunk of you are actually mostly prepared. You're already working on this. So hopefully this webinar will be great for all categories, but it'll help you move along or answer questions that you may have as you're preparing to get this report done. So Dan is having some technical difficulties. If he can hop on, he'll take back over, but you're going to have to hear my voice a little bit longer. So this is the upcoming schedule for federal reports, and we think this is important for you to see so that you can figure out how this fits in with everything. As you know, you already submitted your model plan and your quarterly report, hopefully, which was due at the end of October. The household report, which is upcoming, will be due on December 15th, and this really talks about households served in the last fiscal year. The carryover and reallotment report, the estimated report was due back in September, but your updated and final report will be due at the end of December. And this is all about the funds that you didn't obligate in FY 2023 that you're carrying into FY 24, into this year. The SF 425, this is the federal financial report, and this is due at the end of December. And you'll notice it coincides with that carryover and reallotment report because we anticipate that as you do that FFR, that you're thinking about finalizing that carryover number. The performance data form, the first part, which is what we're covering today, is due at the end of January. And this is all about the money you brought in to FY23 and the money that you're carrying out of FY23. So sources and uses. And I suppose it's also about how you use the funds in 2023. And then the performance data form, that's module 2. So remember, this is a 2-part report. We're covering part 1 today. And the second part is performance measures. And we have a webinar later this week about that section. And this is about how all of the money helped people achieve change. And in this case, we're looking at how we changed their energy burden, or how we may have restored lost home energy or prevented home energy loss. Next slide. I think Dan is back on, right?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great. Yep. Welcome back. All right, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Okay, so today we're talking about the Grantee Survey, and the terms can get a little confusing because the Grantee Survey is not a standalone report. It's a part of the Performance Data Form. So the name of the report's the Performance Data Form. Grantee Survey is the first module in that report. We're going to have a webinar on Thursday about the second module, which is the performance measures, and module 3 as well, which are optional performance measures indicators. So each of these modules 1 and modules 2 and 3 are distinct from each other, and there's differences in the kind of information that you need to complete and gather for the Grantee Survey compared to the performance measures. So just an overview of the Grantee Survey. The Grantee Survey has, like the household report, been collected for a very long time and is a critical way that HHS and the public can understand and track over time how the program is utilizing LIHEAP funds that have been awarded and the average benefit levels that are being provided to households. So there's 2 sections in the Grantee Survey that we're going to go over today. There's one section that's all about the sources of funds that were available in 2023. So the awards you received, the funds you carried into fiscal year 2023. And then section 4 is all about how you use those available funds. And when we say use, we're focusing on the obligations. So what amount you obligated for a specific category like heating assistance or cooling assistance. So the report has 3 main pieces of information that it's asking for. It's asking about those dollar amounts obligated for different buckets or categories. It's asking about the average benefit amounts that were provided to households. So that's the actual dollar amount in bill payment assistance that households were receiving and in other assistance as well. And then finally, to understand each state's income eligibility criteria for different types of assistance, the report asks for you to list the maximum income level for someone to receive LIHEAP assistance for a 4-person household. This last bullet is really important. This is not intended to be an audit report that's tracking dollar to dollar how you're utilizing your LIHEAP funds. This is instead meant to provide a snapshot of how LIHEAP funds are being designated and obligated, and the average benefits and income eligibility criteria being used. So when you complete the report, you want to use the best available information you have, and there may be minor changes later as you receive refunds or updates related to some of the categories, and that's okay. So the data in the grantee survey is used. It's put into the data warehouse, so you can go there and see your past reporting back to 2001. It's put in the LIHEAP report to Congress. It's used to help answer questions about LIHEAP and program activity in recent years. Example is on the bottom of this slide showing how much in funds were obligated for heating assistance, cooling assistance, and crisis assistance in federal fiscal year 2022, and the number of states that obligated funds to each of those categories. So this is important information for the public and decision makers to know. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the federal fiscal year 2023 reporting and what's new with the reports. Okay, so the FY 2023 Grantee Survey has not yet had an action transmittal for the performance data form that it's included in, but that action transmittal is going to be released in December, so OCS is in the process of preparing that. The report has been announced in other communications. It's mentioned in the model plan action transmittal, for example. The due date is January 31st, 2024. So that's an important date just to have on your calendar for when the performance data forms due. And in the past 3 years, this report has been submitted in an Excel spreadsheet, and that was because of the supplemental funds like the CARES Act funds, the American Rescue Act funds being added to the report. OCS has been working to add this report into OLDC, where you submit your household report and model plan and some other reports. And this report is being programmed now in OLDC and should be ready in December. So as with the household report, as with the model plan, you would be submitting this in OLDC. When you submit an OLDC, you again need to save, validate, and have be someone who has OLDC credentials to be able to do that and submit the report. Okay, so good news is there are not any substantive or major changes to the report from last year. So the report looks the same. There's no new data elements you're being asked to report or any large changes like that. But there are two important items to note. The first is that with your FY 2023 funding, you received different funds, but your CARES funds that were awarded by HHS in 2020 and the ARPA funds that were awarded in 2021 had to have all been obligated prior to federal fiscal year 2023. So there are lines in the grantee survey that refer to how much in funds you obligated for CARES or for ARPA assistance, and those lines are still there, but they no longer apply because all those funds had to have already been obligated. So that means there's chunks of the report that will not need to be filled out because those supplemental funds had to already have been obligated. The second thing we want to note is that in federal fiscal year 2023, you all received several different funding awards during the course of that federal fiscal year. But for the purposes of the grantee survey, you're being asked to bucket a bunch of the funding streams together as your regular funds, and the only stream of funds that you're asked to report separately on are the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, or IIJA funds. So you're asked to report separately just on the infrastructure funds. The rest of your 2023 funds are all in the same buckets throughout the report. So we'll show you what that looks like a little later. So here's a little bit more detail on the funding categories. Under number 1 here, you can see the different grant numbers for funds that were released in 2023 and the different CAN numbers or codes as well. So your regular funds in this report are the LIEA funds, the LIEE funds, and only the Infrastructure Act funds are broken out separately, and those are the LIEI funds. So this is a helpful slide for your financial people who may be more familiar with these numbers and may need to know the categories that you need to break things out by. So as an example, if you see in your financial reports that you obligated $100,453 to heating assistance in FY 2023. For the Grantee Survey, you need to break that out and understand how much of that $100,453 was from your regular non-supplemental funds and how much of it was from the IIJA funds. So in this example, it could be 90,453 was from the non-supplemental regular funds and 10,000 was from the infrastructure funds. It's just those two categories you need to report on. Okay, because the report is due at the end of January, we wanted to make sure you have in your hands some resources that can be helpful for preparing the report. The first is we have a check before you submit document that was recently updated that just gives you a nice checklist of items to look at and make sure you have correct in your report before you submit it. So that's a handout in this webinar. We have the instructions that were issued with the action transmittal for last year's report. The instructions for this year's report will be similar and will be issued with the action transmittal in the next few weeks. And then we also wanted you to know that there's a really helpful information memorandum that OCS issued in 2021 that talks about obligations and expenditures and may help if you're trying to understand the distinction there or understand what you need to report on the Grantee Survey for obligations and how you identify what an obligation is. So that is also available. Okay, now we're going to turn to key reporting points for Section 3 in the Grantee Survey, and that's the sources of LIHEAP funds.
All right, so as we talk about this report today, you're going to hear us talk about these two main sections, sources and uses. And for any of you who are old enough to remember actually having to do a check register in your checkbook or balance your checkbook, you would remember having to track how much you carry in from the previous month, what your deposits are against, of course, the bills that you're paying or the expenses you've incurred. And that's really what this report is. It's about how much money you brought into FY 2023 and how you use that money, then how much money you're carrying out of FY 2023 into FY 2024. And so we're going to talk about this report in terms of sources and uses, and that's what we mean. This first part, sources, is pretty straightforward. So the purpose of this is to say this is all of the money that we had available to us to obligate in FY 2023, and it includes funds that are given to you by HHS, so funds that were awarded, as well as funds that were awarded to you in FY 2022, but you didn't obligate until 2023. So you carried those over as unobligated funds. Now, this section is pre-populated with values from their records. So this includes both their awards records as well as the estimated information you reported on funds that would be carried over. And so it's really important for you to check that these values are correct, and they have been incorrect before. And so it's really important for you to look at them, check them against your award letters, and make sure they add up, and adjust that carryover amount. Remember, your final carryover amount isn't due until the end of December, so we know that there will be changes in this number from what you submitted in your estimated report earlier this year. And so that is an editable field, or it should be, and so you can go in and edit that so that your source, you start out with the right amount of sources. Now, if there's an issue with the pre-populated values that you cannot correct yourself, please contact your program specialist right away so that they can address that. So you've gone in, that's a key piece for sources, and that's it. I mean, that's really, I say that's it. I know that that carryover amount can be a little bit tricky, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but to start the report, it's important that that initial base number that you're going to be working with be correct. So very first thing, check those sources numbers, get them accurate, and then you can move on to the uses section, which is what we're going to cover now. And so we're going to cover some key points, and these are things that are not just kind of the key pieces of the report, but things that we see come up, or questions that we see come up year over year. And so we're going to go ahead and address those now. Now, this is all about uses. Like we said, this is about where you have obligated the money. And as Dan mentioned, this isn't an audit report. This is not about expenditures. This is about obligations, which are different in many states. So the main fiscal data that you're going to report in this section is a dollar amount obligated during FY 2023, and it's reported in the first column here for every component of your program. Next slide. So we're going to talk about obligations here, which is a tricky concept, and I really do recommend what Dan said earlier. Go take a look at that information memorandum. All of you should have a definition in your state of what obligation is. And for some of you, that is expenditures, but for many of you, it's not. So expenditures generally include benefits that are issued or paid, but in some cases, obligated funds are not actually expended until after the year. So for example, you may provide contracts to subgrantees, obligating funds to them, but they may not spend them until later years. And so it's important that you're looking at that obligated amount. What is the amount that you've defined as obligated, whether they've spent them or not? And some examples of that that have been provided by some grant recipients are approval letters issued to clients, credit lines established with vendors, purchase orders, contracts to perform services, and this could include subgrantee agreements. The second column that we're going to look at is the average household benefit. And this is the average dollar benefit amounts recipients received during FY 2023. Now, I want to point out something here that we talk about when we do site visits or answer questions over the phone. The way that this report is designed makes it look like the numbers across the row, for example, heating assistance, the total funds and awards in the first column, the average household benefit in the second column, should somehow be synced. But we're talking about two different sources of information. That first column, as we just said, is all about the money you obligated, whether it was spent or not. The second column is all about expenditures. We want you to actually go into your data management system and look at what you actually spent on clients during FY 2023. So this is about the average actual benefit, regardless of what that number is in the first column. And I just want to underscore that again. That second, can you go back really quick? That second column will not always be linked to the first in many states, because just because you obligated funds doesn't mean you spent them there. So this is about your average household benefit from your data system. Okay, next. We have a lot of people that spend a lot of time trying to link those two columns, and that's it's they're not linkable. So calculating average benefits, to report on those average benefit amounts, you should use your program data to identify the benefit amounts each household received during FY 2023. And this is a calculation. For example, this is something that you would do in the heating assistance. If you had 3 households that got assistance, you would add up their benefit amounts and divide it by the total number of households. So it's a straight average. Now, if you can't calculate it because you do benefits in a different way, or you include indirect benefits like program delivery or program service charges, and you have to provide an estimate based on funds used and households served, you need to indicate in the report that average benefits are not directly calculated. There's a place to check a box I'll talk about later, and then we'd also want to see that in the notes. So if that dollar amount you're reporting, and can you go back a slide? If that dollar amount you're reporting in that second column is not the dollars that you handed to a utility or a customer, it includes something more, you'll need to account for that in both the notes and in one of the check boxes we'll talk about at the end of the form. The final column in the the uses section is all about the cutoff annual dollar income for 4-person household. Now this should be pretty straightforward. It should be based on your income eligibility criteria used during FY 2023. So if you go to the next slide, the LIHEAP statute allows you all to set income eligibility cutoffs at different levels for each component. And this is based on federal poverty guidelines or state median. And so one of the examples Dan has put in these slides is that we know the weatherization component often has a higher threshold. We know some people set cooling program thresholds different than their heating benefits. And so we understand if there are different amounts, and you need to account for that in your report. Now, we're going to be looking to see if this matches what you said in your model plan. So remember, all of these reports are linked and they tell a story. And so if you've said that you have one particular income threshold in your model plan, but we see something that doesn't quite match that in your grantee survey, we're going to call you to ask why. So be thinking about that and make sure that your model plan matches up with what you're reporting in your grantee survey. You should use a criteria that was in effect at the beginning of FY 2023, or include a note if you updated to use criteria that was available later in fiscal year. There are a couple of grantees who actually switched to the new guidelines mid-year, and if you are one of those, we recommend you use the criteria at the beginning of FY 2023, or once again, if you want to use that later one, put a note in there that say that you changed mid-year. We have links here of the criteria if you have questions or want to go take a look at that. Next slide. So we've put an example here for crisis assistance. Your maximum income criteria was 150% of poverty guidelines. You're going to go ahead and confirm the dollar amount to report in the grantee survey, and you should check your program records. Most of you have an eligibility chart that makes this very easy to do. You just want to go take a look at that chart and plop that number in this report. But you can verify by going in and checking the household poverty guidelines for mandatory use in FY 2023, and Dan's gone ahead and put a number here, or put a chart here of that. So carryover funds, this is a little bit tricky. Carryover funds are not about funds you didn't spend. These are about funds you didn't obligate. So there are a few different places you need to report those carryover funds here in the grantee survey. And so you need to report multiple carryover values first in the sources. So what unobligated funds did you carry into FY 2023 that were available to obligate in FY 2023? Once again, this is not about unexpended funds. We know people carry unexpended funds between years. That's not what we're looking for here. We're looking for funds that you did not tie up in a contract, that you know, whatever your definition of obligation is, that you didn't allocate out, that you were just holding on to before you tied it up anywhere. And so in sources, you're going to look at the amount of carryover you brought into 2023 from 2022. And on the uses sides, you're going to look at any funds you didn't obligate during FY23 that you're bringing into 2024. So in other words, you're looking at the unobligated funds you carried in and then the unobligated funds you carried out. Keep in mind that for the grantee survey, the amounts you report as being carried over to FY 2024 should match the carryover amounts in your final carryover report, which is due December 29th. Remember, we're looking across your reports to see that there's some consistency. So if that means that you need to go in and edit your final FY 2023 carryover and reallotment report, you need to plan on doing so because it will bring up an error if it doesn't match. This can all be kind of confusing, especially if you're new. And so if you need any assistance in submitting either a revision to your carryover and reallotment report or just making sense of what is carryover and where do you put things in different columns, does this count as carryover, any of those kinds of questions, you're welcome to call either Prize or your program liaison and we will help walk you through it. Don't spend a lot of time trying to figure this out yourself. There are lots of people available to help and willing. So this is just a kind of a handy chart. You know, we put this in every year because we know that there are a variety of funds, especially in the last few years, with different carryover rules and different places to put them. And so for this, both Big Bucket and the IIJA funds, any awards that you are given within the FY 2023 year from HHS will be pre-populated. But you're allowed to carry over in both of these funding cases 10% of funds to the next fiscal year. And so any funds that you were awarded in FY 2022 and elected to carry over into FY 23 would be reported in line 5 of the sources side. And then from the uses side, we'd want to know if you carried any of these funds over into FY 2024. So this is just a handy cubicle chart or something to hand your fiscal folks to show where and how we expect these funds to be reported. Now, this is kind of what we talked about at the top here, that at the end of the day, the biggest thing we're going to be looking for is a consistency between sources and uses. Your grantee survey should reflect how all of the funds you received in FY 2023 were obligated or not, and this includes those you carried over from 2022. This means that for each funding type, the total funding amounts in Section 3, sources of funds, should match the total amount in Section 4, uses of funds. So this is all about balancing that checkbook. And these are the lines that we should see match. Line 10 in Section 3, which is subtotal of non-supplemental funds, should match line 14 in Section 4, total uses of funds. And then for IIJA, it's something similar. Next slide. I think we've given you some examples here. You were awarded $50 million in regular LIHEAP block grant. You also had $5 million in FY22 regular block grant that you carried over from 2022 and obligated in 2023. And so the amount of funds that you had was $55 million. And when we go and look at your Section 4 uses of funds, we'd expect that $55 million to match up. And this is just an example of how that might look. Once again, as Dan said, we're looking at two different kind of tabs or two different sections of the grantee survey, non-supplemental versus IIJA. And so this is just an example of the non-supplemental side. And what we would expect to see is how you've just parsed out those funds that are in the sources side. And then finally, this is a little bit tricky, and it goes to what we talked about earlier about those two columns not necessarily needing to sync up. And this is about consistency with the household report. Now, in your household report, you know, we're telling a story about FY 2023. And the household report is telling us who you served in what components, so heating, cooling, crisis. The data reported and the uses of funds should generally be consistent with the types of assistance reported in your household reports. But we know that the rules for obligations versus expenditures, you might have some assistance types that are in one report that aren't in another. And notes are really important. The notes section is really important to help us understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. So for each assistance you offered in FY 2023, you should be able to report the total funds and awards funds, the average household benefit, and the maximum dollar income. If you obligated 0 for a type of assistance reported in your household report, because say, let me give an example. Say you reported that you helped 500 households with cooling assistance, but then we don't see any cooling assistance obligated in your grantee survey. We have to make assumptions, and we don't do that well. So the assumption we would make is that you use prior year funds or different funding to cover those cooling households, not FY 2023 funding. But we don't know that. We don't know if you've made an error on one of the reports, and we're not going to make assumptions. So there needs to be a note if something doesn't quite match, and vice versa. If you obligated funds for cooling, let's say in FY 2023, but we don't see any cooling households in the household report, the assumption might be that you didn't expend any of those funds, that you're going to expend them the following year. But we are not going to make assumptions, and we could just assume you made a mistake. So it's really important for you to be looking across your reports, just as we will, just as your legislators will, just as OCS will, and be able to help us understand why the numbers don't quite match or aren't quite lined up. And that's what this really talks about, including notes. And I can't tell you enough, just overuse the section. We would rather see a novel here than have to call you about every little issue that we might run into when we're reviewing the report. Notes allow us to understand the reported data, especially when there may be little discrepancies. They're reviewed and they provide context, and we do include those notes in the report to Congress when it's appropriate. So there's some examples here. If funds were obligated to a category but no households were served with that assistance, that's one example. Or if your carryover amounts don't match your FY 2023 carryover and reallotment report, we also want to understand why. Now, I mentioned before that there are 2 questions at the end of the report that kind of, once again, help us to understand or give us context when we're reviewing. And the first is, are there any funds that were obligated in the current fiscal year but will be used to serve households in the next fiscal year? And so this is that situation where you may have contracted funds out to either a contractor or a sub-grantee, but they're not spending it until the following year. Or are average household benefits estimated due to unique program operation rather than directly calculated? And this goes to some of you have different kinds of benefits that aren't direct dollars. Some of you have indirect benefits, for example, program services or delivery that are factored into your benefit amount. And so if any of those average household benefits are estimated for any reason, or you had to do a special calculation that you think we should know about, this is an opportunity for you to select yes or no at the end of the screen and include a note in the note section. I'm not going to go over this slide, but I will highlight a few key pieces, and I really think this is a great tool to use with your staff as you're figuring out who does reports and what each report includes. But as we mentioned, we are using a combination of fiscal and program data to complete this report. So in section 3, the sources of funds, you're going to need your fiscal data to check the pre-populated amounts. In the uses data, the first column in that section, you're going to need to look at how funds were obligated, and this is going to come probably from your fiscal or grants management staff. So, and you'll be using your state's definition of obligation. The average benefits in that second column, you're going to actually go to your data system for your services. So this is not tied to your obligations. It's tied to actual expenditures and who you served in FY 2023. And then program information for that maximum income. As I mentioned, many of you have a chart that you use to determine initial eligibility, and in that chart is appropriate to look at and use to complete this column. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
Okay, so we wanted to just talk about some steps to help you get ready to submit the report by January. So first, as we did with the last webinar on the household report, it's important to be prepared to reach out to your fiscal staff and to let them know that the report due date is coming up, and to maybe develop a schedule or a plan to be able to get the information you need from them, review it, ask any clarifying questions, and check on information so you can get your report completed and into OLDC by the end of January. So this is just an example schedule of kinds of some of the steps you might think of as you're doing that. And we encourage you, if you haven't already, to start reaching out to the fiscal staff just to remind them about this report. As I mentioned, the report in the past 3 years has been submitted in a spreadsheet on Basecamp, but OCS has been working hard to put the report back into OLDC to make it easier for you, and to also have all the reports together in that system for historic continuity. So the report the plan is to submit the report in OLDC. So it's important, if you're a newer coordinator, to make sure your access is working correctly and you can log in prior to the end of January. And there's information on the bottom of the slide showing you how you can navigate to find this report once it's available. It's not yet ready and accessible, but there'll be an announcement about that in the coming weeks as well. We also want to encourage you to look back at your emails from last year for the federal fiscal year 2022 grantee survey. As Melissa said, sometimes we have to ask questions about pieces of information, or there may be a need for a minor change or correction. And so referencing back to those emails from last year can be helpful, so you know what to check for this year, and can make the process easier for you to avoid questions this coming year. So we encourage you to look back at those federal fiscal year 2022 grantee survey emails. So we wanted to go through one or two examples quickly, just to show you what this would look like within the grantee survey. So we're going to show you these simplified examples. They're not what the report looks like in the form, but we just want you to pay attention to what it'll look like in section 3, which is on the bottom left hand of this screen, and what information would be reported in section 4 for the uses of funds. So first, we're going to look at grant recipient X. Let's say they were awarded $25 million in regular non-supplemental funds and $5 million in the IIJA funds, or the infrastructure funds. So that's a total of $30 million. So under sources in the bottom left, we would put $25 million in the category for the regular non-supplemental funds, and $5 million on the amount awarded for infrastructure funds. The report in OLDC, like in the spreadsheets, will add up those two amounts and give you the total in the bottom left, which is $30 million. Let's say they obligated all of their regular funds and they decided not to carry over any of those funds to federal fiscal year 2024. So for regular funds, on the right side now of the screen, bottom right, in the regular funds lines, they would be reporting how they obligated the $20 million in regular funds they received across different assistance types, the amount that was obligated for administration, all the different categories that are in the report. And because they chose not to carry over any of those funds, but to obligate all 25 million, there would be $0 on the carryover to the next fiscal year line. For the infrastructure funds, they did not end up obligating any of those funds during federal fiscal year 2023, which means that they're carrying them over to 2024. So they would report all 5 million on the carryover line. So when we add up the totals in both Section 3 and Section 4, we're seeing that consistency that Melissa was mentioning of 30 million in both places. So all the available funds that could be obligated or carried over, they've reported on how they've obligated them or carried them over in Section 4 on the right. So this is one example. Here's a second example. This is grant recipient Y. They received 30 million in regular funds and 7 million in the infrastructure funds for LIHEAP. So again, Section 3, we would put 30 as their non-supplemental funding award and 7 million as their Infrastructure Act award for federal fiscal year 2023. For regular funds, this grant recipient obligated 90%, but they elected to carry over 10% to 2024. So in the report in Section 4, they would report on how they obligated that 90% of funds, how much went to heating, how much went to crisis, how much went to administration for the purposes of obligation. So that would be $27 million they're reporting across different categories. And then the 10%, which is 3 million, they would report on the carryover line. So 27 to different assistance categories, 3 million on the carryover line for their regular funds. Then for infrastructure funds, let's say they obligated half of their infrastructure funds during federal fiscal year 2023. So they would report half split across those categories, the other half on the carryover line. And again, when we add them all up in Section 3, the total is 37 that they were awarded, and the total uses is 37 million split across those categories. So you want to look closely at the sums for Section 3 and Section 4, and if there is a difference between them, you'll want to double check everything and maybe add a note that helps explain that. Now we're going to move on to some final reminders and take some time for questions.
I'm going to move through these very quickly because this is all stuff that we've talked about. So I'll highlight the important parts. The report's due on January 31st, 2024, and everyone should be planning to complete by this date. Keep in mind that the Grantee Survey is half of the performance data form, and if for whatever reason the performance measures aren't done by January 31st, you can submit each portion of this report separately. We don't want you to wait to submit one until the other's done. So you're welcome to submit each portion, this portion of the Grantee Survey and the performance measures as soon as you have them finished, each one of them finished. We expect it'll be an OLDC. And if you need technical assistance, please contact us as soon as possible. Don't wait until the day the report's due. Call us soon and we can help you with whatever you might need. There's no substantive changes from last year, but you'll notice there's no more CARES or ARPA to be reporting, and that we only need you to break up your 2023 funds into 2 categories. That's the 2023 regular funds. Those are all the non-supplemental, and Dan gave you those codes and CAN numbers earlier in the slide deck, and then IIJA funds. You will need to use OLDC as we anticipate, and as I can't stress enough, Dan said, get in there now and make sure that you have a login and that everything's set up to go, because if you wait until the last day, there will be issues, Murphy's Law. So go in there and get all of that set up, and if you need assistance, we've put the help desk information here. Remember that there's a certification process. Of course, it's not as easy as just hitting submit. You need to save it, validate it. Whoever has the certification role in your state will need to certify it, and then it will need to be submitted. So account for that amount of time in those steps when you're thinking about the report due date and completion. There are lots of times that a message will pop up. We mentioned that we check against all reports. Well, so does the OLDC system. So if one number in your grantee survey, for example, doesn't match up with a number in another report, you may get a warning message. Now, warnings mean that the data might be correct, but they require confirmation. And you should just consider that a trigger. If you see a warning message come up and you check it and it's right, you should always add a note, because those are the things we're also going to be checking. And so leaving a note will guarantee that we don't call you about it. The fatal error messages are things that have to be fixed. These are things that are arithmetically impossible or just absolutely just don't work. The system knows it's an error, and you won't be able to keep going forward or submit the report if you don't fix those. So if either warning or error message appears and you don't understand it or you're unable to resolve it, please contact us and we'll help walk you through that. We will email grant recipients to alert you if there are any issues based on a review, and you really, if you can pay attention, watch for those emails and get the responses submitted as soon as possible, it really helps with the process. And once it's confirmed to be complete, your liaison will accept it. You can always go in and submit a revision in OLDC. Lots of resources listed here. I'm not going to go through them all, but the check before you submit document we've heard from grantees is pretty awesome. So that just helps whoever's putting together this report go in and check to make sure that certain things are in place. They include some of the checks that a prize uses. So encourage you to go look at these as you're completing your report or becoming familiar with it. Lots and lots of reporting training webinars are coming soon, which is so exciting. This webinar will be repeated on January 9th. So if you have fiscal staff that weren't able to come today or other staff members, please encourage them to attend on the 9th. The performance measures webinar, which is module 2 of this overall report, our first one will be this week, this Thursday, and the next one will be on January 11th. We will also be having a repeat household webinar on December 5th at 3 p.m. Eastern. We've been throwing this into all of our webinars. Remember that the module 2 performance measure section requires you to go get measures or information from your vendors, which takes a while and can take a while. So we've put some steps here, but we'd encourage you just to be thinking about that. Of course, we'll talk more about this on Thursday, but if you haven't already talked about this with your staff or thought about this for reporting, your mind should be turning to this, like right now. So if you have questions, please contact us. We can help walk you through that. And we're going to ask one more poll and then gear up for questions. How helpful was this webinar in understanding what is needed to complete the FY 2023 grantee survey? Was it not at all helpful, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful? And of course, we'll take feedback via email after the webinar too if you have some, but this just gives us a good idea of whether we need to update this webinar or get it more honed in. All right, good. I'm glad there was no not at all helpful. So your feedback is that this was very helpful or somewhat helpful. For those of you who checked somewhat helpful, please don't hesitate to write and tell us how we could improve this, or just to reach out for help in the areas that you might still be feeling a little bit foggy about. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan and Joseph and Nicholas for questions. Once again, there's a little box that you can pop your question into, and we'll try and get those answered.
All right, Joseph, we have some questions.
Yeah, so the first question we have here, what if we're unable to submit the report by the January 31st deadline?
So if you're facing a challenge with getting the report done by that due date, the first thing you need to do is reach out to your program specialist and let them know what the situation is, and they can discuss that with you. They may also suggest that we reach out to you and talk to you and help you with any of the challenges. And they're the ones who provide assistance in those matters. So things come up, but the hope is that everyone works to get the reports submitted by the due date, unless there's a big unforeseen circumstance. So if you're anticipating issues already, we really encourage you to reach out after the webinar to your program specialist. And we can try to also assist you in the next month or two to help you to get there.
Okay, a couple more questions here. Why do we not report average benefits for weatherization assistance like we do for all the other assistance types?
Yeah, so in the report, you report average benefits for things like heating and cooling and crisis. With weatherization, it's a little bit more complicated because of weatherization costs and procedures varying a lot by each grant recipient, and sometimes funds being LIHEAP funds being one part of a job and other funds being another part. So instead, if you go on the performance management website and look at the profiles that we make for each grant recipient, we'll show you, we do include the calculated amount that grant recipients are providing for each household for weatherization, but it's not an item that's required in the grantee survey, just because it's a different kind of assistance than bill payment assistance, which is a little more straightforward and looking at the amounts households received.
Okay, next question. Could you explain the difference between obligations and expenditures one more time?
Yeah, so Melissa and I both talked about this a little bit, and that information memorandum helps a lot. But obligation is coming from your own state rules as to what constitutes the obligation of funds. So that's one reason that there's not a strict one-size-all definition for obligation, because it does vary by state. Usually it means a way of designating the funds through contracts or through awards to sub-recipients. But for some states, it can mean, slightly different things than that. Expenditures is a little more straightforward and is usually actually issuing the funds as benefits to households. So for that first column in section 4 of the grantee survey, it's focused on that obligation definition to see how the funds are being designated in that way, even though many grant recipients may expend the funds as benefits beyond 2023. Anything else on that, Melissa?
No, I just really recommend looking at that information memoranda and then calling and asking either your specialist or us at a price if you need further guidance.
Okay, so I think we've reached our time, and we really appreciate all of you attending, and we have that webinar on Thursday on module 2, so we hope to see you there. And we'll follow up with anyone who submitted another question. If you have questions, reach out to us, but thank you for your time today.
Very much.